You are listening to Underground History, a collaboration between Jefferson Public Radio and the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology, or SULA. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and each episode we take a deep dive into little known aspects of history in Oregon and beyond. Oregon is known as home to the world's oldest footwear, the birthplace of Nike and companies that revolutionized swimwear and ski wear, so it should come as no surprise that this mecca of maker culture is also home to the world's oldest known sewn material. My guests today are PhD candidate from the University of Nevada, Reno, Richie Rosenkrantz, and Jeff Smith, professor and director of the Artemisia Archaeological Research Fund and director of the Anthropological Museum there at UNR, who recently co-authored an article getting all the headlines right now on complex perishable technologies from the northern Great Basin and what it reveals about indigenous makers more than 12,000 years ago. Richie and Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, I want to start out by asking about how this project unfolded. So, this was not excavation based, rather a research collaboration that brought together all sorts of specialists. I think there's 14 co-authors, right? And you looked at an assemblage of items that was privately held and then in a museum collection. So, can you speak to this and how archaeologists can make big discoveries and uncover big things without even having to pick up a shovel?
Yeah, sure. So part of what we report on is from professional excavations, our work at the Paisley and Conley caves. But really, what you mentioned and has been getting the headlines are materials that were excavated in the 1950s by a non-professional, and then were kind of unavailable for research until recently when we kind of pursued this. And we had known based on the original publication about these items that they were probably pretty old, but exactly how old and the context to one another was unknown. And so we went about that trying to do questions-based research.
So the Paisley Caves, Connolly Caves, Fort Rock Caves, a lot of really fabulous research that's also been making headlines over the years out there. And a lot of that organic material like rabbit fur and cordage and stuff was like in the dirt, buried in the dirt. So this example of this elk hide that has evidence of being sewn together, was that recovered in the dirt or was it in the cave stashed somewhere? Like how did it survive for all these years?
All of these materials were from a buried context at one point, and they survived because, like the things at Paisley, just the extreme aridity of the shelters themselves. So they're protected, and there's just no water getting into the deposits to break down organic materials that often occurs at most archaeological sites.
Oh, yeah, so it's not only dry because it's the high desert, but it's in a cave, so it's not getting wet and dry seasonally. So that's kind of the special situation that made this preservation so amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
And Jeff, how did you guys date these artifacts? Because some of them did come from archaeological contexts, so you can use charcoal and stratigraphy and all the usual things. But if you're going and getting something from a museum, especially something that was collected by an amateur archaeologist or somebody that was just out finding stuff, how do you, where do you get the dates from that allow you to kind of make, understand how this reflects this assemblage from this time period?
Sure. That's one of the challenges, but also the opportunities of working with museum collections. The site, as we discussed briefly, was excavated by a non-professional in the 1950s. That said, his methods and his record keeping were not that different than archaeologists of that era. And so, thanks to Richie's in depth review of his self published book and the context of some of the objects, we had a decent understanding of where things came from in the caves deposits and how old they might be. With the fiber artifacts and with the leather artifacts that we're discussing, those are all well suited for radiocarbon dating. And as your readers and listeners might know, radiocarbon dating these days takes such a tiny, tiny fragment of material. So, with great care, Richie and his team reviewed the objects in the museum collection and paid attention to small little frayed pieces that, if removed, wouldn't alter the aesthetic or structural integrity of the objects. And we were able to get very precise radiocarbon dates working with the Penn State Radiocarbon Lab, with which we have a pretty strong connection. So Richie and his team carried out a lot of the first steps of that dating and then sent the material off to Pennsylvania to get dated as the last stage of the process.
That's amazing that the technology allows it to be so much less destructive than it used to be. That allows you to take more samples and have more confidence in the dates because it's repeated over and over, correct?
Correct,
Yeah.
absolutely. And with a museum collection like this, where the exact context of each object is not precisely known, these large scale dating projects are definitely the way to go. While costly, they'll give you a very good picture of when people were at different locations and what they were doing, just because you have so many radiocarbon dates.
You're listening to Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and today we are talking about the oldest known example of sewn material recovered right here in Oregon. So I've been noticing that this is making all the headlines, and I think it's really interesting because a lot of times the archaeology of this era, or the indigenous occupation of the land, is really dominated by, or only includes, stone tools and the byproducts of making them. And sometimes that is harder for folks to relate to because we don't all go out and hunt anymore. But a sewing kit, like, we all have sewn to some extent. So I think is that something that you're seeing as people are relating to these examples of sewing needles and cords and woven materials in a different way than they would necessarily get as excited about, like a projectile point?
I think so. The archaeological record of this ancient era is, as you mentioned, so dominated by stone tools, and that's not a lot of people connect to that technology anymore. As someone who studies stone tools for a living, I recognize that fact. And so records like Cougar Mountain Cave and Paisley and Connolly, some of these other sites with excellent organic preservation, allow us to have conversations about all sorts of different issues that often get lost when we're talking about stone tools specifically. Things like gender division of space and different community members' contributions to the groups. There's one object that didn't get discussed in this recent paper that we've talked about over and over again. It's a crooked stick to which somebody hastily attached an unsharpened flake with a bit of sagebrush twine, and it really looks like something that, like, a little kid would have done, trying to emulate their mom or dad's work. And it's objects like that and some of the other materials from Cougar Mountain Cave that really allow us to have the conversations about the past in a much richer way than stone tools alone.
Yeah, and it really humanizes this story. One of the things that I kept reading and didn't really fully understand the significance of, you keep talking about an example of tight-fitting clothing. And at first I didn't really understand if that was like the outfit part or whatever, but the distinction is this isn't like a poncho. This is something that is worn close to the body. It's more tailored so that it actually serves to keep people warmer. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah, and that's really connected to researchers who have focused on kind of the origins of clothing
Uh-huh.
and kind of thinking about. I mean, it's based on these physiological principles of insulation, right, and physiological limitations of the human body. And so, a draped piece of clothing, like a poncho, like you mentioned, provides significantly less warmth and protection than like a sewn, multi-layered, tight-fitting piece of clothing. And that's really the distinction that we talk about in the paper, and is kind of a distinction that researchers interested in ice age, cold adaptation, and origins of clothing kind of point to, as these kind of distinct differences in how we think about clothing.
And the pieces that you found, they could represent some other kind of sewn material for a shelter or something. But I was wondering, if they are tight fitting clothing, is there like any evidence of the people that might have wear, like, sweat or skin cells or something like that? Do we have the technology to find traces of that on this elk hide to kind of confirm maybe it really was worn by someone?
That's potentially possible with kind of new developments in a thing called paleoproteomics, but that's not actually something I've ever considered. And
Well,
paleoproteomics is kind of this burgeoning field in archaeology, so it's possible. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, if it works, then you can credit a historical archaeologist for the idea, I guess.
Yeah. And if the technology doesn't exist today, it almost certainly will 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. And that's one of the real values of these museum collections, is the opportunity to go back and apply these new methods that didn't exist very long ago. And that's where Richie's paper here really shines, is it brings together all sorts of cutting edge techniques to tell a really compelling story.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I think is so amazing about this whole, collection, the suite of artifacts and all the different ways you pulled this information together, because there is a big push, especially from our tribal partners, to minimize excavation where possible to not disturb sites. And there's lots of really valid reasons for that. So shifting focus to digging through existing collections that were understudied, or we have new technology, new research questions. This is not only a great research opportunity, but it can also maybe help mitigate some of the damage, the impact of the damage to these sites. And maybe that's kind of like, I don't know, a cathartic experience for all involved. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have kind of made a career, or half of my career anyways, out of doing collections-based research, and I really enjoy it. There's so much we can learn from museum collections, and far beyond just radiocarbon dating organic items, like just reviewing old field notes and coming up with new interpretations, digging some charcoal, reevaluating some tools, and I think this is a major way that we can continue archaeological research in the future while minimizing invasive and destructive techniques, while also, kind of pushing things forward and coming up with new things.
And I bet, Jeff, in your museum, there is plenty of, you could keep PhD and master's students busy for a generation with just collections that exist at UNR alone, let alone at the U of O and other places like that.
Yeah, allow me to put my museum director hat on for a minute. I started my career as a field archaeologist, and I did my fair share of excavations, and it's costly and laborious and time consuming, and as you mentioned, ultimately destructive to archaeological sites. And as someone who's relatively new to the museum field now, I see boxes from our department and my predecessors, and recognize that there are several lifetimes of work that could be done with those materials that were already excavated. And that work would likely yield really interesting and exciting results in a very minimally invasive way.
And can you speak a little bit on how tribal partners were involved with this project at different phases?
In a project like this, we didn't have a lot of tribal engagement. Perhaps not surprisingly, many tribes aren't interested in knowing that an object is 10 or 11 or 12,000 years. That knowledge is already built into many of their worldviews. We have had better experiences working on other projects with tribal partners. We've done some lithic teaching workshops where we've gotten together with different communities and Flintnapped for a few years. And we've got some other things in the works. But with a redating project like this, it's not generally super interesting to most communities because they already know the answers to the questions we're asking.
Yeah, and it maybe is annoying that there's like it feels like science has to prove something that they could have told you to begin with.
Exactly.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So one other thing I just want to talk a little bit about because Richie, I think I forgot to mention in the beginning, but you're a research affiliate with the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, and several of the co-authors on this paper are from there. And I went to school there and studied with a lot of those folks. So I've heard Tom Connolly and Elizabeth Kallenbach and and Pam Enzweig talk about textiles for a long time and woven textiles. So I'm curious if you could speak, either one of you, about the distinction between why it's really important that this wasn't like a evidence of weaving to create a fabric, but sewing two pieces of fabric together. Like, why is that so, important or revolutionary in this particular finding?
Yeah, well, really comes down to the long-term record, and sewn leather and leather items or in the Northern Great Basin archaeological record are pretty rare at all times. But what we see in these few late Pleistocene or Ice Age contexts is that it kind of shows up more, and that's one of the things that we argue in the paper is we think there's this connection between climate, technology, and culture that shifts from the Pleistocene into the warmer Holocene, and so when what we see in the Holocene record is a very large and diverse use of fiber industries, as Tom and Elizabeth and Pam talked about for years. And what we saw at Cougar Mountain Cave is that there is that's happened in the Pleistocene, but we also see this addition of eyebone needles and these sewn objects, and those things don't really persist into the Holocene. And so it's really about, in our eyes, climate and technology and how they work in tandem and change in tandem.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today on this episode of Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose. Our show producer is Charlie Zimmerman. You can find this episode and many more wherever you get your podcasts.